Thanks, guys, for doing this. Thanks. Welcome back to Houston.
Great pleasure to be back in Houston and to be back at the Progressive Forum. Thank you for keeping this thing alive for decade after decade. It's nothing quite like it.
Well, thank you. We both learned lessons together along the way. Douglas, do you have any opening remarks or introductory remarks for your friend Bill McKibben?
Well, I'm just honored to be with Bill. I don't use this word lightly. In fact, I seldom use it, but for a long time, Bill has been a hero of mine. Not just because of his activism on the environment, on climate, and what we're going to talk about today, Here Comes the Sun, and the solar revolution, but because he's so kind and decent and warm and has so much integrity and spirituality that he just is constant resource of energy in his own right. He makes one believe that you can be optimistic and we can do things and not throw in the towel. So Bill, honored you're here. I hope there's some people here from Rice University where I'm at. But guys, whatever Rice people, but the one question after reading Here Comes the Sun, that I was looking at this timeline, and then you write about 1978 when this book comes out on Sun, and Jimmy Carter is president, and David Brower's involved with bringing out the project, the former head of the Sierra Club. And there is this moment that the sun looks like solar is the big thing, not just solar panels on the White House that we hear about Jimmy Carter doing, but you talk about, which I didn't know, Carter going to Colorado and really giving a stunning speech about solar power. Was that the moment, the big moment, do you think, when people took solar to a new level more seriously as an energy source?
Well, it should have been. This was the first big chance. Solar panel is invented in 1954 at Bell Labs in Edison, New Jersey. Those of us of a certain age, funded this work by dropping dimes in payphones once upon a time, It was so expensive at the beginning that the only thing you could use it for was satellites. But come the 1970s and the energy crisis, suddenly we need some new ideas. Jimmy Carter, an engineer, seizes on this notion of solar power and does put solar panels on the White House. More importantly, in his 1980 budget, he proposes spending enough money so that by the year 2000, the US would be producing 25% of its power from the sun. Had we done that, we would live on a very different planet now, a cooler one than the one we currently inhabit. We didn't do that, of course. Ronald Reagan was elected, took the solar panels off the White House, and more importantly, took all the research and development money out of the thing and aborted the first real effort at building a solar civilization. It didn't really restart again until the turn of the century, this time in Germany, when the Green Party held the balance of power in their parliamentary system, used their leverage to demand that the German government pay a good price to people who'd put solar panels on their roof for their electricity. This reasonably expensive project by the German government created enough demand that the Chinese quickly learned how to start building solar panels cheaply. And over the next 20 years, drove the price down again and again and again. 5 years ago, we passed some invisible line where it became cheaper to rely on the sun and the wind than to burn coal or gas or oil. I just want to reiterate that point. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. I don't think anything else in our recent history is probably as epochal as that in its implications. look, we're at a very dark moment in our history in this country, and we're at a dark moment at our history in this planet. The things that I wrote warnings about 40 years ago are all coming true on the, in the poles and in the atmosphere and in the oceans. But there is this, all of a sudden, one big good thing now happening. And that one big thing is good enough and big enough that it stands some chance of taking a bite out of both the climate crisis and the authoritarianism crisis that we're confronting. And that's just the sudden, rapid surge of cheap, renewable energy around the world. That's what the book sort of documents in its first chapters, and then tries to think about what the implications of might be. Because they're probably going to be pretty large in sort of the same way that, learning to burn coal and oil and gas had fairly large implications for the history of our planet in the 18th century. I think we're at potentially one of those moments.
What are the economics? Bill, you're a reporter at CORE. We've got breaking news here. How would you explain this scoop, and why does it matter? What are the economics?
Well, I mean, the basic bottom line is we live on a planet where the cheapest way to make power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. This hasn't actually gotten through, I think, to most of us in a sense, because we've spent 40 years calling this stuff alternative energy. That's where it's filed in our brains. I think we still mostly think of it as sort of like the Whole Foods of energy, nice but pricey for special people. It's now the Costco of energy. It's, cheap, available in bulk, on the shelf, ready to go. And that has begun to transform the world. About 36 months ago, we began to see this we hit this very steep part of this S-curve. It took from 1954 to 2022 to install the first terawatt of solar power on this planet. The second one came in 2 years. We've just passed, I think, the third one in about 15 months or so. China, in May, was installing 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. A gigawatt is the rough equivalent of a large coal-fired power plant. So they were putting up the solar-powered equivalent of a coal-fired power plant every 8 hours in China. We are producing 30% more energy from the sun this summer than we were last summer. It's within a few years will be the largest source of electricity, and within some years after that, the largest source of power on this planet, period. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary rise, and the economics are the necessary condition for it, but it's not just switching out cheaper. It's not as if we just found a cheap version of coal or something. It's also very different in its form and in its implications going forward. That's what makes it, the reason we have to do it is because we will melt the planet if we don't do it otherwise. And this won't stop global warming, but it gives us the first tool we've had that actually allows us to scale some kind of an assault against the forces of rapid runaway heating. We're beginning, I think, to shave tenths of a degree off how hot the planet gets, and every tenth of a degree moves another 100 million people from a safe climate zone to a dangerous one. But beyond that, it changes the nature of energy. It's no longer the way that we've conceived of it in our entire lifetimes, something that is available in a few places that can be controlled by a few companies, a few countries, a few rulers who have the reserves of this stuff. Suddenly it's something that's available every place on the planet to everyone every day. And that's a completely different basis, really, on which to run a civilization.
I think you quoted, and Bill, you wrote the Jimmy Carter book. Carter said when he was mounting these, you cannot embargo sunlight.
Well, think about that. Carter was exactly right, because in the 1970s, embargoes were what we were worried about. Doug is right, OPEC and the oil crises. You not only can't embargo sunlight, think about how the geopolitics of planet Earth would have been different over the last century had oil been of relatively trivial value during that time. Think of the wars that we would not have needed to fight, the coups and assassination attempts and terrorist plots and things that would, humans are, granted, very good at starting wars, but figuring out how to start one over sunshine is going to be a struggle even for the most bellicose of us,
When you're writing about solar, compared to, say, nuclear power, you can understand the rap that nuclear got because of problems of, Bodega Bay, California, or issues of radioactive waste, or, 3 Mile Island, and then Chernobyl, and you can see why there's a hesitancy. How did we develop, and who is afraid of the sun? And there wasn't a crisis of solar in a big way. So who was spiking it?
Well, the opposition, look,
oil and gas?
On most of the world, nobody's afraid of the sun. Across the rest of the world right now, it's the place where almost everybody's turning. This revolution is being led not by the US, though we invented all this stuff. It's being led by the Chinese and followed by the developing world and now Europe as well. In this country, obviously, the only people who really fear solar and wind energy are people who own oil wells and coal mines, because there's, pick a number, whatever the day's market price is, but there's 30, 40, 50 trillion dollars worth of reserves of fossil fuel whose value will be steadily eroded if we instead turn to clean energy. I think that, credit to the oil industry, they've recognized the threat that this presents. As Randall was saying in the introduction, California, fourth largest economy in the world, has now installed enough solar that they're using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity than they were 2 years ago. If I know that, they know it, at all the corporate suites in this city. And so when candidate Trump last summer, you might remember, in a not very secret meeting with oil executives, said, "Give me $1 billion and I will give you anything that you want," they went to work. The Times did a great series of stories about how Harold Hamm became the chief arm twister for the Trump campaign. They raised about $500 million between advertising and lobbying and direct donations in the last election cycle, and that was enough. So now in America, over the last 6 or 8 months, we have this really paradoxical thing. As the rest of the world moves aggressively in this direction, we're doing everything we can to try and stomp it out. Sometimes to almost incredible proportions. The Trump administration 2 weeks ago shut down work on wind farms off the coast of New England that were 90% complete. If they get away with that, if that stands, we were talking earlier today, archaeologists 1,000 years from now are going to be puzzled about what are these pylons off the coast of Rhode Island? What strange religious significance might they have had to people of an earlier era? If they get their way, 20 years from now, America will be the colonial Williamsburg of internal combustion, where people come from abroad to sort of see how we did it back in the olden times, But I don't think we'll do that. I think that eventually that fever will break because economics is a strong force, and
Bill,
Texas proves it, yeah?
Yeah, you wrote an editorial in the New York Times in July, speaking about Trump. You said, why Trump's war on solar power will fail. What makes you so confident?
Well, here we are in the world capital of hydrocarbons, and we're also in the state that's producing clean energy now faster than any other state in the union. And not, for the most part, out of a deep Lone Star desire to combat climate change, I would say. Out of a sense that this is the cheapest way to produce energy for meet growing demand in Texas. I was very taken earlier this year watching the legislative session in Texas. The oil industry did its best to try and quash some of this stuff. The bill that came closest was one that some people were calling DEI for natural gas. It would have required that if you wanted to put up 5 megawatts of solar, you had to put up 5 megawatts of gas generation too. Lots of people emerged out of the woodwork in Texas, especially from, I think, rural parts of the state, to say, guys, this is, what keeps our school system going is our wind farm, our solar array. Don't do this. And so the Texas legislature decided, to go to work on redistricting instead. And given that they don't come back for another 18 months or so, right? I mean, that much more time for that momentum to build. Texas is in way better shape energy-wise now than they were 2 years ago. I mean, the cost for electricity on peak days is far lower, and the grid is far more stable because there's a lot of solar power and a lot of batteries. And the people at ERCOT have been talking about that a lot, where you shouldn't see the sort of blackouts and things that have plagued this state because that energy mix is now much more reliable. So, there's no question that the Trump administration is doing a lot of damage at just the wrong moment. This is the moment when we should be accelerating, in part to meet the climate challenge, but also in part to meet the China challenge. Because if we decide to spend the next 4 years not pursuing these technologies, we're going to wake up in 2028 and the Chinese are going to own the technological future and with it the economic future, and probably as a result an awful lot of the global political future too. We've pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. The country that put the most carbon into the atmosphere is the only country on Earth not participating in the effort to help it. My prediction is that when the globe meets in November for its annual climate talks, it's the Chinese that will have the moral high ground here and will exploit it dramatically, I think.
What is it about the American consumer that's afraid of solar? Meaning, when you talk to people about electric vehicles, sometimes they'll say, look, I live in Chicago, I get an EV, I saw a news story that my car died, I couldn't find a place to recharge, the technology's not ready yet. And in the sun and solar, I think there's a rap that people say, well, yeah, in Arizona, solar might make some, but it does not make sense here in Virginia or Maine. What you say to those people?
So I usually pull out a map of the world and say, here's the country of Germany, where no one has ever gone for a beach vacation in their life. It's the big cities of Germany are well north latitude-wise of the big cities of Canada. And yet Germany is one of the biggest solar countries in the world. I live in the mountains of Vermont. I've run my house off solar panels for a quarter century. And just once you've managed to make this switch, the advantages at every scale are so obvious. Electricity is an elegant thing. So, for instance, the kind of trinity of appliances that we use to take advantage of clean, cheap electricity, the EV and the e-bike for mobility are amazing. EVs work great. Donald Trump has insisted that they only drive for 15 minutes before I think he thinks that there's a long extension cord that comes out the back, and but in fact, Chinese EVs charge in 5 minutes and go 500 miles. What do you want, The e-bike is even more elegant. I mean, the bicycle's pretty good technology to begin with, and now there's a bicycle without hills, and it uses about 1/5 of a penny's worth of electricity to go a mile, okay? To heat and cool a home, the heat pump is a huge improvement over the furnace in the basement. It's efficient, it's quiet, and it both heats and cools. I'm the cook in our house, so I can tell you that the induction cooktop that I use, $60 from Amazon, is way better than the open fire that I cooked on for most of my life. It boils water twice as fast, and your child is 50% less likely to get asthma than if they live in a house where there's a campfire in the kitchen every night. So it's truly, we're talking about things where the resistance will quickly reduce as people learn. That's one of the reasons we're doing this Sunday thing. All around the country, people will be doing things like opening their homes to show their neighbors their heat pumps, giving people rides in their EVs. There'll be e-bike parades, lots of places, this kind of stuff. This is not a hard sell. The trouble is, and this is the fly in the ointment here, we have to do this fast for it to matter. Climate change is a timed test. It's really the only first timed, real-time test that we've ever faced as a species. Most of the things we deal with, as long as you and I have been alive, we've been arguing about health care. Should we have national health care? Yes, we should. People die and go bankrupt every year without it. Someday we will join the rest of the industrialized world, okay? And it won't be harder to do it because we delayed. When we eventually get around to it, we'll be able to do it. Climate change isn't like that. Once you've melted the Arctic, nobody has a plan for how you freeze it back up again, and that's really where we are. We're now at the place where the jet stream is beginning to behave remarkably erratically because it depends on the differential in temperature between the equator and the poles, and that's much smaller. We're at the place where the Gulf Stream is beginning to flicker and falter because there's huge amounts of fresh water pouring off a melting Arctic that are disturbing the salinity and density balances of the Atlantic. I could talk about that stuff all night, but the time is very short. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that if we're to stay on anything like the Paris timetable, we have to cut emissions in half by 2030. And, thank God, by the way, for the incredible work of one of your local climate scientists, Andrew Dessler, who led this brand new report on climate that was an answer to the Trump administration's feeble effort at climate denial earlier this year. It regrounds us in the very dark science. That's why we have to move fast.
Raise your hand.
There he is,
Andrew.
down front.
Thank you.
That's why this is, if Andrew wasn't complicating our lives by warming the climate, then we could wait for market forces to do their thing, But we need to force the spring. 30 years from now, we will run the planet on sun and wind because it's cheap. But if it takes us 30 years to do it, then the planet we get to run on sun and wind will be a broken planet.
How do we grapple with it if we make the leap that we've got President Trump in for 3.5 more years, and you're seeing a Republican Party just throwing solar and kicking it and dumping on it? How does a momentum for solar grow in the popular imagination, and many young people who were climate activists are feeling very despondent right now, feeling like it's hard to move the ball up the mountain because it's like Job, coming right back down on them. How do you light the fuses and excitement of people?
More than anything, that's why I wrote this book, to try and get people to understand the incredibly ripe moment that we have. That's why we're doing this big Sunday thing, Christ the King Lutheran, 2 to 4 p.m. on September 21st, precisely to try and build that kind of enthusiasm around the country. Obviously, we're not going to do anything in Washington, at least for the next 18 months and probably for the next 3 years. That means that we're going to have to do a lot at the state and local level, and happily there's a lot we can do at the state and local level. So think for a minute about rooftop and home solar. It's about 1/3 of the clean energy business. Let's leave aside the solar farms and things for a minute. Just think about your home. It costs 3 times as much to put solar on your roof in this country as it does in Australia or the EU. A little bit of that's the tariffs on panels. Mostly that's the incredible cost of bureaucracy. Every municipality, and we have 15,000 in this country, has its own set of rules for this. They all have their own teams of inspectors. It takes weeks, usually months, to get this done. In the rest of the world, it's a matter of 3 or 4 days. We can solve this problem. The National Renewable Energies Lab put out a thing called the Solar App Plus a few years ago. It allows for essentially instant permitting. A contractor just types in what equipment he's putting on what address, the computer checks the database, if it looks good, up on the roof they go and set to work. That'll drive the cost down considerably. California, Maryland, and New Jersey have mandated it, so the rest of the country should too. Even better, even more beautiful example, and we were talking about this at the Chronicle earlier today, is this stuff that we're calling balcony solar. All over Europe in the last 3 years, millions and millions of people have gone to their local I don't know what you call Best Buy, in Europe, but that's where they've gone and come home with a solar panel that not for the roof, just with the hooks on it that you hang over the railing on an apartment balcony or on a front porch. And it just has a normal plug that you stick in the wall. You don't need to rewire anything. You don't have to call the electrician, but you're often producing 20%, 25% of the power that you use for a few $100s worth of solar panel. That's illegal everywhere in the US, except in that progressive bastion, the state of Utah, where legislators earlier this year, unanimously in both houses of the legislature, passed enabling legislation for it because some state senator stood up and said, look, my fellow Utahns, if this is good enough for Hamburg, it's good enough for Provo, and then there are now, you can go on YouTube and find lots of pictures of smiling Utahns putting up their balcony solar. It's a good reminder that this cuts ideologically in ways that are, for my money, you're the preeminent American historian of our time. I think one of the things that's interesting about solar is the fact that, yes, good progressives like the idea that we're fighting climate change with the groovy power of the sun. But I've lived on dirt roads my whole life, some in red states and some in blue. And I have lots of very Trumpy neighbors. There are Trump flags flying, and a lot of them have solar panels on the roof. And the reason is, when I talk to my friends, my house is my castle. I'm going to defend it with my AR-15. And now I have an independent power supply for my castle, And you know what? I'm enough of an American that I recognize that impulse in myself too. I mean, not the AR-15 part so much, but my house is my castle, and I love the fact that it's, that I can power it myself.
Is there a prototype city that maybe people could look at? That's a leader in solar, and if you go there, you can see how a community's thriving, or is it too much hopscotching around right now?
There's a certain amount of hopscotch, but there are places all over the world that really illustrate what's possible. And some of them are places that even a few years ago we thought of as hellholes, If you'd ranked a list of the dirtiest cities in the world 10 years ago, the top 10 would have been cities in China. Okay? None of the top 10 is in China now. Those cities are starkly different, quite much cleaner air, and I haven't been to China in the last year and a half or so, but I've talked with people recently who say even in the last 6 or 8 months, the biggest difference now is that the cities are markedly quieter, because 50% of the cars sold in China now come with a plug dangling out the back, and it'll be 100% within the next 3 or 4 years. If you think Detroit is the center of the automotive universe, that is, I'm afraid, no longer anywhere near true. There's 3 or 4 cities in China whose names are hard to pronounce that are now where all the innovation's going on. They're producing fantastic cars for very little money, and as a result, it's not just China now, they're dominating the developing world. In fact, let me tell you a story about a place that would really sort of illustrate all of this. Pakistan, which is a poor nation hit harder by climate change than any place on the planet. Terrible floods in 2010 and 2022, the biggest floods since Noah. They're having another bad flood this summer. There's 4 or 5 million people out of their homes in the Punjab right now. And in the summer, the cities of Pakistan routinely hit 125, 126 degrees now. It's almost unbearable. But Pakistan's one geographical advantage is a long border with China. So the Chinese have this huge production of cheap solar panels, and they began leaking across the border quite dramatically about a year ago. People who'd been, importing rice or cement started importing solar panels. This was not a government initiative. It was just people who were tired of expensive and unreliable electricity. In 8 months last year, Pakistanis, mostly using TikTok videos as their guide, built the equivalent of half the country's national electric grid out of solar panels. Okay? Pakistani farmers were really early adopters. If you're a peasant farmer in Asia, often your biggest cost input is the diesel required to run the pumps that bring up the irrigation water that's from the deep tube wells that are the legacy of the Green Revolution. Those farmers were buying these solar panels. They lacked the money to build the metal supports for them often, just put them on the ground, pointed them at the sun. Pakistan last year used 35% less diesel than they had the year before. So if you really wanted to see people whose lives were being shifted overnight by this revolution, that'd be a good place to look. And in the last 6 months, the same thing seems to be starting to play out across much of rural Africa. Any place where there are good Chinese trade routes existing. And that's a miracle of its own kind, because there are 700 million people in Africa without access to electricity at the moment, 600 million. Fossil fuel isn't going to do it. They had 250 years to bring power to rural Africa, and they manifestly failed. So now the job is on the sun, and people are building village-scale microgrids by the thousands now across rural Africa, and people getting power for the first time. So there are lots of good examples.
Let me ask a question about China. Stay with it a minute. Because in your book you write, what if Trump succeeds in making America irrelevant on renewables? Can the planet still be okay if other countries accelerate renewables? And you're right about China being a force multiplier and developing countries being a force multiplier.
That's right. This is going to be a big, this is a very live issue today. Today, Energy Secretary Chris Wright is in Europe trying to browbeat the Europeans into changing their global warming rules around methane so that they can import more US LNG to meet. Trump told them that if they didn't want to have 50% tariffs, they had to promise to buy a lot of liquefied natural gas. The problem is, since they take global warming seriously, their rules currently prevent them from buying a lot of liquefied natural gas. So Christopher Wright went over to tell them that the Paris Accords were, in his words, silly, and that that the only reason people worry about climate change is because they read about it in the newspaper, and that therefore they should relax their rules. It's possible that Trump will succeed for a short time, I think, in convincing other countries that in order to avoid tariffs, they should buy some LNG. My guess is that will be a short-term sugar high, because I think any rational ruler of any country, say any Asian country, which is where it really matters, will look at this and think, here are my choices. I get to rely for my energy supply from now on either on a country as fickle and erratic as the United States, or I get to buy a bunch of Chinese solar panels, at which point I then rely upon the sun that has so far risen above my country every day of my life. Indonesia, 3 weeks ago, announced plans to build 100 gigawatts of solar power in the next 5 years. Indonesia is the 4th largest country by population in the world. That seems to me a pretty strong straw in the wind about where people are going to start heading.
I've heard a couple of complaints about solar from some environmentalists. For example, in Palm Springs area, Joshua Tree, Salton Sea's disappearing. It's getting hotter, and people will say that the grids of the solar is killing vegetation in the natural world because it's too intense. What do you say to people that have that concern?
So if one's worried about the desert in particular, there's actually been a lot of data in the last 6 months even that shows that solar farms are starting to really stabilize desert ecosystems. One way to think of a solar farm is that it produces both electrons and shade. And on an overheating planet, shade is actually a tremendous asset. It allows for moisture retention and things. And so there's been a lot of work about the biotic crust of the desert, very delicate and easily damaged, regrowing much, much faster in areas with solar panels than not. In general, I think our sense that the landscape is under threat from the spread of solar and wind is much overdone. We're going to have to use some land. We think about 2% of the surface to produce our energy in this way. But that's less than we're using at the moment. For instance, in America, corn is our biggest crop. We grow 60 million acres of it. You can drive, and you have in some of your travels, large swaths of the country where you're never out of sight of a corn plant, But of that 60 million acres, 30 million of those acres are used for growing corn that's turned into ethanol. We're growing gasoline, okay? That 30 million acres produces 3% of America's energy. If you just covered those 30 million acres with solar panels, you would produce more energy than the US currently uses, okay? 100%, not 3%. Now, we don't want to just turn Indiana into one large solar farm. We want to spread it out, and we can and should. But it's truly amazing. I was telling the story earlier today at the Chronicle of being in this field in Illinois last summer. And there's this with his farmer, it's in the book, who's converting his much of his corn farm, half his corn farm, to solar array. It says, here's an acre that I have in corn, and it gets used for ethanol, and that ethanol in a year is enough to drive a Ford F-150 25,000 miles. Here's an acre next to it, which I've converted to solar panels. It produces enough electrons in a year to drive my Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV version of the exact same truck, not 25,000 miles, but 700,000 miles, okay? So you get some sense of the extraordinary efficiencies that can be unlocked as we do this. And he's still only using half the field for solar panels because there's big rows in between those things, which have given rise to an entirely new human craft. The terrible name for it that we're using at the moment is agrovoltaics, but it means growing stuff in between solar panels. And it turns out that lots of crops like to grow where there's some shade and moisture and things too. And so the example that I keep using is in France, the vintners are finding that grape varieties grow about 60% more yield if they're interplanted with solar panels because there's some moisture there. These kind of things, these are like a huge new area for human ingenuity to take place. So when I say that, I mean, the subtitle of the book is The Last Chance for Our Climate, and I believe that. I think it's the only scalable thing we have. But the other half of the subtitle is A Fresh Chance for Civilization. And in a way, that's the part that interests me most, the idea that there's a kind of reset possible here for the ways in which we interact with the world around us. And not to get too hippy-dippy about it all, but there's something very beautiful about the idea of, you know, energy from heaven, not from hell, you know? Last year in Vermont, we had a total eclipse of the sun. I think part of that eclipse came across parts of Texas too, but in Vermont it was a big deal. It was the biggest crowds we've ever had, the biggest traffic jams in Vermont history as people flooded into the state. But they were very happy traffic jams because everybody was just sort of awed by this spectacle. I was on the quad at Middlebury College where I teach, and there were 1,500 kids standing there watching, and they put down their phones for a good half hour and just watched this beautiful thing happen, you know? And it was a reminder that the sun is the most charismatic object in our corner of the universe. It already gives us light and warmth, and via photosynthesis provides us with our supper, and now it's willing to give us all the power that we could ever need. That's a really interesting new bargain for human beings. Fossil fuel was a very useful thing, for it produced the world that we know, you know? So thank heaven to the people who pioneered and produced it. But its costs are now very high, and we have something else much more beautiful to take its place. You know, I feel as if I have, having spent, 35 years being a Cassandra, I feel as if I have a slight amount of credibility to be the bearer of a certain amount of good news for once. And I think this really is good news if we seize it and seize it fast.
Okay. I think we do have to touch on emotions. I think there is something to this group therapy because this is an existential threat. You both are emotionally open people. How do you maintain perspective? How do you stay motivated?
You mean to write or just to be on the planet right now?
Yeah, just to be on the planet now, dealing with these really serious
Teaching. You know, the Woody Guthrie, great folk singer, used to always talk about I'm being a hope machine. And, you know, when you teach at Rice and you're meeting somebody, and you at Middlebury and you're seeing somebody 19, 20 years old, you know, Jack Kerouac used to call them angels of pure future. And you're seeing young people and our kids, and, you know, they've got everything ahead of them. And so it feels good if you can be talking in a more optimistic, not grim way about their future. And the so-called doom scrolling is going on all the time, and we're getting these feeds of Instagram. And if you're looking, and you can get down in the ditch real quick, and then you have news cycles of the assassination of Kirk out in Utah, followed by this is today the anniversary of 9/11, and we're remembering that tragedy, and then we're seeing war in Middle East and in Ukraine and Russia, and starvation in Sudan and Chad. It can just become very overwhelming, and so you try to stay positive. And I would tell young people, if you're feeling overwhelmed, and you love the natural world, then just find a place that you can be a friend to a state park. You can do, like you said, put your own house and do solar and make it that's your thing. We don't have to. It's not going to be walking on water is not made in a day. We're not going to be able to overnight flip these switches. But I think Here Comes the Sun does an amazing job of reinvigorating people about the potential of solar. And I'll ask Bill to tell us about how's music playing with the idea of the sun.
Well, I was just thinking about that when you were talking about Woody Guthrie. It was his banjo that had on this machine kills fascists. It said, and I think you can sort of say the same thing about solar panels in some sense, that they're an attack on authoritarianism, on the concentrations of power and wealth that we're up against. But music, from Woody Guthrie on, has been a huge part of this. I obviously stole the title of this book from George Harrison. When I was telling these guys backstage, when I went to look in Spotify, Here Comes the Sun is by far the most streamed song in the Beatles' vast catalog. Twice as many humans around the world listen to it every day as Hey Jude or Let It Be or anything else. And I think it's because it had, in a very dark moment, maybe the darkest moment of my lifetime, it has a kind of gentle and optimistic idea, but also because it connects us to that sun. Is there a human being who does not grin when the sun comes out and hits them in the shoulder blades, from behind the clouds? People get sick, seasonal affective disorder when they don't get enough sunlight. There's a very profound connection here, and every musician almost that you can think of has at least one. If you go to sunday.earth, we've got a great playlist of the dozens and dozens and dozens of great songs about the sun. There is a extremely short playlist of good songs about fracking, I must say. This is where we want to go at some level.
And we're in a synagogue, and the thought of light, is we're always, or whether, this idea that light is going to uplift us, and oil, as you said, coming from the underground. Is that something people feel, do you think, in an intuitive way?
The biggest, a big part, it's no accident that Sunday here in Houston is at Christ the King Lutheran, because a big part of the work being done as we head on to the September 21st is by religious communities across the country. I'm glad we're here at the temple. My colleagues at Dayenu, the Jewish environmental movement, have done absolutely yeoman service in building this. And it's really been a great privilege to watch over the last 30 years the rise, and to help a little bit with the rise of a religious environmental movement. You know, for a very long time there was no such thing. In liberal congregations, we thought of the environment as something to get to once we dealt with poverty and hunger, and in conservative congregations, we thought of it as a kind of way station on the road to paganism, you know. But now I think people have truly, the most important, arguably the most important document yet of this millennium was Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, on global warming, which drew its title and imagery directly from St. Francis's Canticle of the Sun. I'm headed to Rome in early October to meet with the new guy, with some other climate people. There's the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si, and the American Pope Leo seems to be intent on continuing this work. In the Vatican, they broke ground on a large solar farm outside Rome earlier this summer. By the end of the year or early next, Vatican City will be the first completely solarized nation on planet Earth. So that sense that we're called to this seems strong to me. I'm an occasional Methodist Sunday school teacher, and it's right there in the first paragraph of the good book, you know. God gets to work creating the sun, and giving it as, announcing that it's very good, and giving it to us as a great gift, one that we should happily and gratefully accept.
My favorite chapter in your book was the last one. You call it spiritual, but you hesitated to use that word. But it's emotional and psychological, and you go over ancient traditions that drew humanity, where we are mindful of the sun all the time. I'm an enrolled member of the Osage Tribe of Indians, Oklahoma. We call the sun grandfather. It's a very affectionate, connecting feeling. Could you reflect on that a bit, your last chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. Our human beings, prehistory is not the same as history. We don't have exactly the same connection to understanding how people were thinking that we do when they began writing stuff down, but we can tell a lot from looking at what they left behind. The entire world is covered with monuments to marking where the sun comes up on the solstice and where it sets on the equinox, and on and on and on. Clearly, the first job of almost every mythological system in the world was to come up with an interesting explanation for how this thing rose above the earth every day, disappeared for 12 hours, and then reappeared again on the other side. And people came up with spectacularly interesting and powerful, from the solar boats of the pharaohs to, turtles carrying the sun. I mean, it's been, it's funny too, because the sun is literally the only thing in the world we really can't look at directly, and yet it dominates in many ways our imaginations. And it's not just prehistory. We're actually at a fascinating moment of discovery about the sun right now. On New Year's Eve last year, a satellite launched by NASA approached the sun more closely than we've ever gone before. It was traveling faster than any human object has ever traveled before. And it brought back all sorts of fascinating new information about how the sun flares and what the winds off it are like and things. It's an astonishing machine, just turning hydrogen into helium at extraordinary volumes, and it's going to be there for several billion more years doing that, which is a very, in an unstable time, a quite comforting idea. It really is the one thing that we can absolutely count on, and that's a very human thing too. I feel dramatically the lack of security at the moment. I don't think I'd ever, until this year, quite understood how much I'd taken for granted the stability of the country and the civilization in which I lived. Because now I don't take it for granted at all, and there's a lot of times when I wake up at 3 in the morning absolutely panicked about where we are and what we're doing and how it's going to end. But there is something comforting in knowing that part of the story. I have a brand new, 18-month-old grandchild, my first, which now means that I know someone and love someone who's going to be around in the 22nd century. So we better come up with some plan for how the world is going to work in the 22nd century. I mean, that's our most basic and fundamental obligation as human beings, one that we are currently failing in very dramatic fashion. Now we've got something to seize that at least gives us a framework on which to build that kind of future.
Was there a missed window on solar with Obama? I remember early there was that Solyndra crisis of business, and then he backed off some from it, and it didn't.
Yeah, he did put aside money that helped, incrementally. But the U.S. was not it was not a crucial part of this story until Joe Biden brought us the Inflation Reduction Act and really tried to give us a way to catch up to China. That was our effort to try and get America back in this game. And it was beginning to work. People built a lot of factories in 18 months. And they did it, he did it, bless his heart, in the reddest and most rural areas of the country. The biggest battery plant in the Western Hemisphere is in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. And it did him not one lick of good politically. He was legislatively skillful and rhetorically the opposite. He failed to communicate in any significant way what it was that he had accomplished and was up to, and sadly, that's a big part of the job too. And so here we are. We're on the sidelines for the moment, at least at the national level, but we needn't be on the sidelines at the state and municipal level. We're a big, sprawling, diverse country where federalism is supposed to be a real thing, and Texas is a paradoxically interesting example of how that might play out in the years ahead.
I didn't do my due diligence, but do you, the big fossil fuel companies, or Exxon and Phillips 66, et cetera, are they willing to invest in solar in a serious way?
No, they're not. Darren Woods said last year, someone asked him this question he said, we're never going to invest in this stuff because it doesn't, quote, return above average profits for investors, unquote. And he is correct, it does not. It's not something that can be hoarded or held in reserve. You can make plenty of money building solar panels. There will be, already are, solar billionaires, wind billionaires, but there aren't going to be solar Rockefellers in quite the same way, because once the solar panel is up, the sun delivers the energy for free. And from Exxon's point of view, that's the dumbest business model of all time. But from everybody else's point of view, it's great news. And it's great news for economies as a whole, because you have a windfall of cheap energy with which to do all kinds of interesting things, who knows what. So that's the economic problem. It's almost too cheap, If there were a way, I suppose, to grant Exxon some way to own the sun, then probably we would have long since developed solar power and built it out all over the place. But that's the obstacle we have to overcome. That was what the IRA tried to do, to put up the money to allow people to get the part of the upfront capital to make the expenditure that then would yield all of this decades of free power in return. That's what the fossil fuel industry fears, and why they quashed the IRA so quickly when they came into power. But that's the sadness here. And I will say, we now know from great investigative reporting that the big oil companies knew all about climate change back in the 1980s. When I was first writing a book on this, turns out they were investigating it too, and had great scientists, and their product was carbon, so of course they found out about it, and we now know that they knew exactly what was going on. I mean, literally, Exxon listened to their scientists and began building their drilling rigs higher because they knew the ocean was going to rise. But they did not tell the rest of us. In fact, just the opposite. And that's one of the reasons that we're now in the deep hole that we are in. But just to conclude that thought, the crucial rule of holes is, when you're in one, stop digging. And in this case, quite literally, stop digging. We've got to leave most of the fossil fuel that we know about in the ground, because there's, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no way that the atmosphere can handle the amount of carbon that will pour into it if we dig up and burn everything that we know about. It's just going to be really hot. Yeah, okay, good point. The Earth will, that is a useful reminder that the Earth will, the third rock from the sun will remain in place no matter what we do. But the other times that we've filled the air with CO2, we've had 5 major extinction crises on this planet, and we're in the midst of triggering the 6th, and it's going to be a doozy unless we change course fast.
I have I think it's the last question, and it's a history question. And it's a history question about being in a hole. Doug, you've written about the Gilded Age. Similar age now with extreme inequality. And there was so much outrage that it elected Teddy Roosevelt, started Progressive Era. He was the first mover on the environmental movement. How does today's outrage break through into meaningful politics? What can we draw, hopefully, from the Gilded Age?
Well, there's a lot of, Theodore Roosevelt broke from his class. I mean, he broke, he used to tell J.P. Morgan that my Justice Department knows no ticker tape. He didn't care what Wall Street was doing. It was from 1901 to 1909, he started kind of a turnaround on saying the biggest thing to be isn't the most wealthy, but to be a great citizen. And that included being in the Army, or it included being a scientist, it included being somebody who did good locally, but he loved the federal government more than states, and he thought he would go negotiate like coal crisis. People he would go and sit down with, which is hard to do, because coal was the energy. I mean, Chicago is coming from coal in Illinois, and the East Coast coal, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and he negotiated labor and big industry, and then of course trust busting, breaking up tech companies if they get too big now would be something like that. That when you're looking at the trinity of the tech companies all sitting there at the White House the other day, should they be broken up? Are they becoming monopolies? And these are questions that we have to ask. I like Governor Pritzker of Illinois, who's a billionaire, and he's been on television shows joking about, yeah, I am. So it's not a question of shaming billionaires to me, as much as it is talking about wealth inequity, and you're dealing with this rarefied 0.5% that's controlling the United States and what we do, and we have to find ways to at least have guardrails or TR protective laws, so we're just not a country of oligarchs, of a group of 40 people running the show. It's supposed to be a democracy where each of us have an equal sense of worth.
Absolutely. Doug's entirely right. And inequality is if climate change is the physical threat that we face, the grotesque levels of inequality in our society are the sort of, are sapping our politics more than anything else. That really began, John D. Rockefeller was the first model of the modern plutocrat, and it was because he understood that if you could get control of a scarce and valuable thing, that you would then end up with enormous wealth and power, and it's been the model ever since. Look around the world in which we inhabit at the moment. Our biggest oil and gas barons in this country were the Koch brothers, more refining and pipeline capacity. They used their winnings to erode the foundations of our democracy. The reason that it's been so easy for Donald Trump to kick them over is because they were rotted out from the inside when he got there. The biggest oil and gas barons in Europe is Vladimir Putin, who's currently shooting drones at Poland, something that should give anyone with any memory of 20th century history a chill down the spine. Being able to start to erode some of that. I can't think of any physical thing we could do that would start to erode that inequality more quickly than take away the material basis of that scarcity and replace it with the just wash of sunshine across the planet. That's a place to start, not a place to end. We've got lots of work to do ahead of us, but that's one very set of concrete steps that we have to take because, as I said before, we're going to burn down the earth if we don't. But that if we take them, we can do it in ways that produce lots of other benefits too. And that may be the biggest. It's, the experiment that we've run, at least since Ronald Reagan, with allowing inequality to get wider with each passing year, has now reached the logical conclusion. There are 3 men in this country with more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans combined. That can't work, and it isn't working, and we're watching it around us. It's a dark moment, but there is at least this one ray of literal light that's shining through.
I have presents for you both, and I want to preface it by, this is your 4th event. Doug, we've done 3 events, but when you call me, it's an event. So I'm calling it 4. I'm a Saturday Night Live fan. They give, these nice jackets for 5-timers. So I'm setting up these presents for you guys, and
Thank you, Randall.
and
That's
open
very
up in
kind.
front of everybody so you can see your 4-time
Got
award.
past the bond. There you go.
That's, let's see, Bill, this is yours. They're not the same.
What do we have here?
Oh my goodness. Wow. Made it into the bobble world.
Yeah, these are silk jackets.
Let's see yours.
They have the number 4.
Oh, excellent.
And enjoy it. You guys, thank you for a beautiful evening.
And you guys realize what a
Terrific audience.
gem Randall is
Thank you
that
very
you
much.
all have. Thank you, Ring. Thank you.
Yeah, well done. Well done. Thanks, Doug.